Hi, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us during your lunch hour. My name is Melody Delmar and I'm the Native American Heritage Coordinator for Missouri Humanities. Today we have Deborah Taffa, who will be talking about Native voices in classrooms and how that's changing right now. And we'll be talking about her experience in the media and also as a children's reviewer. So I also want to encourage you to ask questions in the Q&A or to the panel, and we'll have a brief question and answer after the presentation. Thank you again, and I'll let you take it from here, Deb.
Thank you, Melody. Kumathom, everyone. Hi, I'm Deborah, and I am a citizen of the Yuma Nation and a descendant at Laguna Pueblo, speaking to you today from Oahu, where I am staying with my daughter for the pandemic to help with my toddler grandson. So I grew up on the Yuma River until I was 6 years old, and we moved to Farmington, New Mexico, where my father took a job on the Navajo reservation. And I'm here today to speak to you in three parts. First, as a Native American who remembers being a child, reading books in school and at home in the 1980s, as an Indigenous mother of 5 children, children who I help navigate American schools and libraries, and third, as a professional who spends a lot of her time writing, teaching, editing, and reviewing literature for the publishing world. So my most recent story appeared in the Los Angeles Review of Books, if you're curious about my writing. I teach creative writing at Webster University in St. Louis. And most pertinent to this talk, I review children's literature for Kirkus Media. Kirkus Reviews is an American book review magazine headquartered in New York City. And in the beginning, Kirkus thought she would get maybe 20 or so advanced readers' copies a year ahead of their publication, and that she would read the books and advise people whether or not they were worth the read. 90 years later, Kirkus receives hundreds of books and has writers like myself who review about 100 of them every week. Now, my editors at Kirkus send me books by Indigenous authors mostly, and while I occasionally take adult books, they understand that my main focus and desire is to read and review children's books. And this might seem like an odd choice. I mean, I got my MFA at the University of Iowa in adult nonfiction. I write for adults. So why do I spend several days every month and week, really, thinking and reading children's books? And the short answer is that I care about kids. I want them to have empathy for each other. I want them to be able to listen and have respect for those who are different than them. I'm an optimist. I believe the future can be better for our country if we teach our children to appreciate and tolerate viewpoints and perspectives that are different than their own. And I feel that literature is the place where we share and celebrate each other's stories in such a way that we come to understand one another and learn to conquer our loneliness and fear. Now, the longer answer as to why I review children's literature and take an interest in Indigenous books, for that I have to go back to my own childhood and the memories that I have of never seeing myself a mixed breed, binational, tribal citizen in any American books, movies, or even on television, or rarely so. Most of the Native people that I saw in the media, they were shooting it out in cowboy westerns, right? Such as in these photos down here, or they were mascots for football games. Now, my mother was born in Socorro, New Mexico, to a partially Native mother and a partially Native father. And they rarely talked about their tribal lineage. But my father was very familiar with his tribal traditions, and he taught us a lot about our unique Yuma culture. And because he talked about our ancestral ways, I knew that there were elements in these Native depictions that I was seeing on television that were completely wrong. These depictions were stereotypes and caricatures, and they felt insulting, and it made me wonder, like, who was telling these stories? Because it didn't seem like it was anyone who really knew us. Now, some of the things that I understood to be wrong were, no one in my family rode horses, even back in the day. The human people, my people, we lived alongside the Colorado River and we were fishermen and swimmers. And no one in my tribe wore their hair traditionally in braids. My ancestors wore dreadlocks that were made with the river mud and water from the Colorado. And so here I have pictures of two different Southwestern tribes, and neither of them have braids. The third thing I would say that I realized about these depictions of the mascots and the cowboy westerns was that even the mascot with the feathered hairdress, it was a caricature of the tribe that it was supposed to represent. So it was completely far off and not true at all. And I'm happy that I knew that when I was fairly young. The truth is that there are 573 federally recognized Indian nations in our country today. Some of us call ourselves tribes, other people say nations, bands, pueblos, communities, native villages. And even if you're native yourself and you're listening today, you might be surprised to hear that my tribe wore dreadlocks. That is how profound the diversity in this country is. It was incredibly diverse, this continent. And despite the misnomer Indian, right, that was taken from this wrong-headed notion that explorers had arrived in India, we were diverse. The term simplifies us, and this simplification couldn't be further from the truth when it comes to our varied languages, religions, foodways, clothing, and ceremonial practices. All of which is to say that as a small child growing up in New Mexico, I never saw an image of myself, my family history, or my family contributions as American citizen. Bottom picture, there's a picture of my dad on the right and his brothers, and this is his cousin. They were dressed up for a powwow. So the books that I read were a lot of times, they looked like, the old Dick and Jane. They were blue-eyed kids who lived in an American neighborhood that looked like a grassy utopia. But let's look at the data from 2018. So Kristen Aronson is a professor of psychology at Bates College, and she specializes in identity development. She is also the co-founder and the director of an organization called We Need Diverse Books. She has a website, I think that's called Diverse Book Finder. And this organization works to understand how children process and understand race, as well as appropriate, effective, and productive ways to discuss the topic with them. So she specifically looks at picture books to enhance intercultural relationships and self-understanding during childhood. The Diverse Book Finder is a comprehensive list that works as a tool for parents who are looking to find books for their kids that have diversity. Schools and libraries use it too, and they have compiled the data that you're seeing on your screen right now. So in 2018, we can see that 80% of the children's book market features white children and animals. So 50% of the books published have white kids and 20% have animals. Now, some of you may ask, well, what is really egregious about that? What's wrong with that? Well, the Diverse Book Organization and identity development psychologists, as well as Kirkus Media, have all done studies that illuminate why this imagery is a problem for young readers. Now, for white kids, it gives them the false impression that the world is all about them. And it does very little to prepare them for a future in a diverse US workplace, right? They could very well grow up and do business with people in Japan or Qatar or Turkey. I mean, their boss, could be a Nigerian via London. Who knows, what their workplace will be like. And if they understand cultural pluralism, it will help them. As for ethnic kids, I'm uniquely positioned to speak on how painful it is when you don't see any positive imagery of you or of your people in the media. More of what I mean, Jennifer Manick is an associate professor of elementary education and a coordinator of the graduate reading program at Bridgewater University in Massachusetts. And she advises curriculum developers with their K through 5 reading diversity. And when she was asked about what drove her to multicultural children's literature, she told a story about a young Black boy in her class who just hated books and did not like reading. So she was teaching a lot of 7-year-olds in Florida, and she was leaning on the adage that books are either windows, mirrors, or bridges, and that kids need all three. So a window allows you to see into another culture. And I mean, who doesn't want to do that? We all love to travel. We miss getting on airplanes and going to other places and other cultures because it's exciting. It makes us well-rounded. It makes us more sophisticated. It's a good thing to learn about other cultures. That's what the window does in a book for a child. A mirror reflects the child back to themselves in the book. And a bridge allows them to see how all of these cultures are interconnected, how we depend on each other to create our communities. So this teacher recounted a story of this kid that I was talking about who was having a hard time reading, and he just could not focus on the book until she brought him a book that had Black characters who had struggles much like his own, and then he perked up and he asked for more books to read. A healthy identity requires positive role models. We know this. The mirrors in the books that a child reads help them develop their identity. Now, the term identity crisis was coined by a psychologist named Erik Erikson, and it was based on work that he did with the Lakota people, and I believe the Yurok people as well. And he himself was a blonde Jew who never felt like he fit in. And he recognized via his studies that we all need a community that we feel involved with and that we work for and that we develop our goals around, a purpose that gives our life meaning. And it's very difficult if you have lost your sense of traditions to develop that purpose and to feel that community. So he studied Native Americans because he was aware of the identity struggles that were a result of forced assimilation and Indian boarding schools. And so he coined this term identity crisis to address the difficulty that not just Native youth, but all youth have when it comes to forming a set of goals for themselves, right? So I told you that the first part of my talk would address my own experience as a child reading books in the 1980s. And I could tell you that it was very confusing to go through school and to have a curriculum and to have books in the library that rarely had portrayals of myself. My father had told us that Acoma Pueblo, for example, it sits next to my grandma's home at Laguna Pueblo, was the longest inhabited city in the country. That's just a fact. It was over 1,000 years old. But then imagine my surprise when I realized that we were celebrating the bicentennial and that all of the celebrations and parades and picnics touted America as having 200 years of history. It felt like we had been snubbed. What had happened to all the years that had come before? It was a difficult pill for me to swallow. So kids need to know that their people made positive contributions if they are to become upstanding citizens of our society and have self-confidence and esteem, right? Anyone who knows the ballet knows that Maria Tallchief was the first American ballerina. She was also Native American. People who love rock and roll know that Link Wray, an indigenous musician, contributed the power chord to help invent the genre. Our very democracy was founded on ideas, right, and philosophies that were inspired by the Iroquois League of Nations. Native kids need to hear this and see this. They need to see their culture celebrated in literature. Without this positive reinforcement, it's hard for them to have and maintain that self-esteem and to become contributing citizens. The second phase of this talk, I said, would be focused on raising my 5 children and how I navigated and negotiated their space in history classes when they sometimes didn't include Indigenous history. And the one thing that I knew was this: I did not want them to learn history, right, that began with the tragic loss of land, the forced assimilation of Indian boarding schools, or even the civil rights movement. Those events are part of our education that we need, it's true, but in some ways, They kind of create trauma and struggle as a really central part of our identity. I wanted my kids to learn and to hear about Indigenous stories that made them proud and happy, stories that highlighted our ancestors' successes. And for this reason, my husband and I focused a great deal of energy on teaching them about this hemisphere's amazing archaeological sites. We started at the library. We filled in gaps that were, they hadn't heard about in their history books at school. And then we took them to old cities where they could learn and actually see that their ancestors were mathematicians, scientists, architects, and that they were builders. So we traveled obviously to Cahokia in Illinois. We went to Mesa Verde and Chaco Canyon in New Mexico. And we went as far afield to take them to see Mayan architecture, Chichen Itza, Tulum, Palenque, Yaxchilan in southern Mexico. We even took them to Machu Picchu in Peru, which are all featured here. And my kids excelled at school. They have done very, very well. And I say this because I think it's important that we note that, a healthy dose of self-esteem makes children confident in the classroom. So in my work with Kirkus Media, my editors, they recognize, right? They recognize that there's a need for stories that achieve several different things for BIPOC kids. And they use a little different terminology than they're using down here. So I'll first explain the terminology we use at Kirkus. When I read a book that is about diverse characters, I'm asked to put them, after I write my review, I have to put them into a category. It's either learning, inclusion, or cultural identification. By this, I mean that Kirkus's diversity collection, it goes way past groupings by race, ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, or disability to consider what the desired reading experience is for the reader. Like, what does the reader want? The consideration of experience for the reader, categorized as learning, cultural identification, or inclusion, is a main part of the effectiveness of Kirkus Collection's recommendations because it addresses the demand for information about diversity content, right? Contextual information. For example, so say you have a reader who's looking for a book to learn about a historical event or a tradition. That experience is a learning experience for the reader in their identification process. If you have a young child that's looking for a coming of age story with the main character who is experiencing similar social struggles and family dynamics, that experience is an identification. I'm going to read this and I'm going to realize that my problems are real because I can identify with this character. It makes me feel seen. Or do you have a reader who wants to have like a silly romance or a rollicking science fiction book where the hero looks like her, but doesn't explicitly have any sort of issues outside the fun of that genre? The difference is subtle, but it means a great deal to the child. A child who is specifically worried about identity issues will want to read a book that helps them identify with the same problems as the narrator. But aren't BIPOC kids entitled to have a little bit of silly joy in their reading as well? Don't they also want to have books that don't deal with heavy issues having to do with culture and race all the time? I am one who firmly believes that children of color deserve to have a sweet romance that has characters that look like them. Books that have value without addressing any of the heavy-handed topics we associate sometimes too much with good BIPOC books. And I would mention that the Black publishing industry in particular, I think, has come to call this niche Black kid joy. Like Black kids need joy. Reading can be entertainment. Kids have the right to have fun, is the concept. And to reassure any parents who are listening to actions, we do not only recommend them because they are a thematic match to our goals of diversity, right? They also have to have literary merit. So before being added to the diversity collection list, the quality of the writing and the illustrations in each book, if there are illustrations, they have to meet the very discerning standards of Kirkus reviews. the toughest and most authoritative voice in book recommendations since 1933. With some exceptions, books that include diverse protagonists, they're not the sidekicks, right? So the readers see characters of color and diverse faiths, LGBTQIAP characters, disabled characters, doing things, being the main focus rather than being the helper. Within each of the broader categories that I explained, further standards include scrutiny for stereotyping, measurements of authenticity, and the avoidance of tired, damaging tropes, which is why they asked me to review Indigenous kids' books, because I'm fairly familiar with that culture. Although, as I said, it's very diverse, I have to do my homework too if I'm reviewing a book that comes from far northern Canada or Alaska. Finally, speaking as the professional who spends a lot of my time teaching, editing, and reviewing literature for the publishing world, I'm super happy to report that the picture book, middle grade, and young adult publishing world is making an aim to increase the number of books with multicultural and intersectional characters in the next couple of years. So HarperCollins at the end of 2019 announced a new imprint called Heartdrum, which is a native-focused imprint. And it's being led by Cynthia, who is a best-selling author, and Rosemary Brosman, who's a vice president at HarperCollins. And they're doing all they can right now to address a growing need for native, we call them native creatives, right? Native writers for kids, and especially illustrators for kids. In fact, if there are native illustrators who are listening to this talk today, I would encourage you to contact me with your information so I can pass the name on to editors and writers I know who are looking for your services. It's wonderful that this field is growing in my estimation. Regardless of what might happen in classroom curriculums in the future, the private publishing industry is trying to fulfill the wish made by one of this country's most admired Black poets, Lucille Clifton. And she wrote, "The literature of America should reflect the children of America." Finally, I guess in closing, I would like to address the issue of whether or not cultural outsiders can or should write stories about minority groups. Can these books be accurate? I think it's very difficult to have enough cultural competence and cultural humility to speak or write about another person's racialized experience in this country. If it's a book that is supposed to be learning or identifying, it's very difficult, right? And the last thing I would say is that I encourage any parents who are listening today, or caretakers of kids, that it's a good idea to read books with your children and grandchildren to make sure that the information they're receiving it helps rather than it harms. So we're in a moment of history when unlearning some of what we have learned in the past is necessary, even if it's difficult. And to highlight what I mean by that, let me just share a small bit of history that some of you might not know. The first best-selling genre in America was the captivity narrative. So it was Mary Rawlinson wrote it first of all, and she was taken by she was captured by some Native people, and some of what she wrote was sympathetic to them. She was released. But then a slew of fictional copycats followed. And for 200 years, there were a lot of them. They became Western films, dime store novels, comic books, and it even went across the ocean. And in Europe, in Italy, they did spaghetti Westerns, and in Germany, they did children's books. And here's one that I've put up for you called Tintin in America, which has a ton of wrong-headed ideas. So do not assume that the book or the television show or the film that your children are consuming, or that it's done well, or that it's delivering the right messages to your kids. And if it's not, delivering the right messages, or if it's a great way to have a conversation, is what I'm saying. If we want our future to be better, we have to examine our own beliefs and be careful about our sources. And for our society to advance, I think we can have disagreements and differences and in the context of knowing that we are all Americans, to establish and celebrate this common ground. Thank you for listening today.
Thank you so much, Deb. I love this. And we do have a few questions and comments. Willie said, very helpful and awesome content in the presentation. And then he asks, what are the organizations studying diversity in children's books in the USA?
Yeah, there is, We Need Diverse Books is one that comes to mind right off the top of my head. And there are a lot of universities that are doing the work, I think, in their psychology and children's literature departments. There is a writers group called Kweli, I don't know if I'm saying it right, it's Kweli, and I can send the information to Melody so that when she sends out an email from MH, it has information for illustrators, that sort of outreach that I did, asking for anyone who's interested in giving me their website to find it there.
Right, yes, I also wanted to just let everyone know that if you have any questions related to the content, I'm going to be sending out an email tomorrow. It also has a brief survey that really helps us build our program and know what kind of content you'd like to hear about in Native American heritage. I do have a question from Facebook from Caitlin, and she says, as a toddler mom, I'd love to know the best places to purchase books like the ones Deb mentions. Can you give us a few recommendations?
Yeah, I think I said, let me look at the exact org. There are places that you can go, including Kirkus Media, that you basically can click on the books via categories that you want and you're interested in. And then you can read, the reviews are 170, between 220 and 270 words. They're not very long. And it gives you an idea of the book's content. And at least with Kirkus, you can be sure that BIPOC people have also been reviewed by people familiar with the culture. So the stereotypes have been weeded out, or the tropes that seem to be damaging for kids are probably not there. And Kirkus is known to be pretty tough. So they're not afraid to give negative reviews, even though it's hard to do. The other one that I mentioned quite a bit in this talk it has to do with We Need Diverse Books. And their website is called, it's a diverse books list. And now, of course, I can't find it in my notes.
Yeah, I can share that again on the email that's going to go out to you, so you don't have to do too much shuffling. Yeah. So here's a question or comment relevant to just what's happened right now in Missouri. I think it kind of went nationwide in the news about a principal here who was questioned about a children's book about Ronald McNair, and a few parents had some objections, and so he defended the choice and read it to the whole school. I don't know if you heard about that, but
no, I did not. When did that happen?
I believe in the past 2 weeks. I can't remember.
Oh, I'm going to look it up. McNair. Huh.
Yeah.
He's a principal at an elementary school?
I believe so. I'll have to send you the information. So we have another comment. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say that, it's one of the things that I think is, I don't know specifically about what happened with that, but I do know that when somebody that doesn't know your culture tells stories about it in a way that feel wrong-headed, I think it hurts everyone, no matter who they are. But it particularly hurts people that are never seen in the media. So if you never see yourself in the media, and then what you do see is completely wrong, I think it feels more damaging than if you see yourself in the media all the time, and then there's a little blip where somebody kind of gets something wrong, and then you think, oh, well, not all Italians are mafia people, and then you kind of move forward or whatever, a little kid. but there are a ton of positive portrayals from Da Vinci to, then it kind of does, it becomes not so, it's not such an egregious error to your eye. So I think people need to be a little sympathetic with little kids who are just hoping to find something that they can build an identity on that will make them be a contributing member of society rather than somebody who's disgruntled. We don't want to have citizens who are disgruntled. Go ahead, Melody.
Right. Yeah. And some people commented that was in the Rockwood district, and that person also just said, another person said, "You were excellent. What state do you live in?" I think you said you're in Hawaii, but you're
I'm being
great.
Elizabeth Warren's Aunt Bee for my daughter. Remember how Elizabeth Warren talked about her Aunt Bee coming to save her? I think a lot
Right.
of young women right now, they're in danger of losing their careers because they're trying to work from home while caring for a little toddler. And
Right.
so I made the difficult decision, because I can teach for Webster University virtually online this semester. I came out here to stay with her and to wrestle this little guy while I'm trying to work as well. It's challenging times.
Yeah, I hear you loud and clear. So we have one more question from Sandy. One of my concerns is the curriculum in many states still teaches that Native peoples are past tense or one-sided views of history. How can we get the educational foundation to update the de facto curriculum that is taught?
I think there's a little bit of a tension with indigenous populations in particular, that because so much has been taken from us, we guard our stories and our personal stories very closely. And there's a big vetting about who can hear and who belongs and who doesn't belong. And I really do think that we need to move to this place where we think about becoming more influential in society rather than guarding against having the stories taken. Until we step up and become influencers, until we step up and act with generosity to people. The truth is, I think that a lot of Americans, no matter what their background is, can learn and need stories from Native America, because our elders and our lifeways, they're very healing. They are a balm for a lot of what is wrong with America in its commercialization. And they really, I think there's a lot of sound thinking in our philosophies. And so I think that generosity is from us to the world is key. I really do. And that doesn't mean, I know that there are obstacles. I know that there are gatekeepers. But I think if there is a silver lining in everything that's happening right now, it is that a lot of good people are thinking, how can we make things better so we don't see so much anger, so people feel that they are being heard. At a minimum, people just want to be heard. And I don't have a lot of hope that I can change somebody's mind who is set in stone and they're 75 years old. But I do know, and this is one reason why I like to work with the kids' books, is that children, they are open, they are listening, they are learning, they are watching us. And if we reach out to the kids and teach them new ways of being, and new ways of listening and having empathy for each other, then we can hope to have a better future in this country. It really is, it's up to future generations, but we have to help lead them in the right directions.
Right. I totally agree and hear you loud and clear. And representation matters so much, and especially as Native people, where we are often othered, and it just speaks a lot to how we can improve and build on not doing that to each other.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks again so much. This is so informative. So some people asked if this will be available and shareable. Yes, it'll be available on Facebook. Please share, and it'll be available through there, and also eventually in our YouTube and our website. Related to the content, Deb is going to join us again next month on October 22nd for another webinar called Columbus to Coachella, a panel discussion on appropriation versus appreciation. I had to read it off my other screen, so I'm very excited about that. We have a panel of people who identify with the Indigenous, Black, and Latin communities, who will be talking about expanding on the topic of cultural appropriation, what that means, and everything. So I encourage you to join us for that as we release that information on our Facebook this afternoon. So thank you so much, Deb. That was wonderful. And
Thank you.
appreciated that so much. And we'll get that information to you all. Thanks everyone for joining us on Facebook and also on Zoom. I hope you have a really great day.